So thank you for having me here, and thank you for holding on till the last presentation of the day. I'm sure all of you are very tired. So the good news is there's going to be some amount of overlap between what Vega just presented, as he mentioned earlier, in terms of the context in which we're looking at, or the question that I'm going to be addressing over here is going to be very different from the question that Vegard has described in his earlier presentation. So this is joint work with Vegard. I guess I don't have to repeat that. And this work is forthcoming in Brookings NCAR India Policy Forum. What is the motivation for this paper? Essentially, again, we're going to focus on corruption in the paper, there's been this a tremendous amount of discourse in India, and I guess it would be a concern in South Asia itself about the perceptions about corruption in the public sector. And perceptions about corruption in public sector in India seem to be much worse than in other emerging economies, particularly if we think of the other economies, the so-called BRICS, where you have Brazil, China, South Africa. They seem to be performing much better in terms of having lower perceptions about corruption in public sector than they exist in India. And so broadly, what are these concerns that we have with corruption in the public sector is these potential adverse implications for the delivery of public services, and then you can carry that forward to the sentiments towards making private investments and ultimately towards growth, since we are, the focus largely over here is on growth issues. But that's, the broad macroeconomic concern that we might have, but we are going to delve into more microeconomic issues over here. So what are the ways in which we can address these concerns about the leakages or the poor delivery of public services, which seem to be very much prevalent in South Asia, in India, and I'm sure here in Pakistan as well. And one of the mechanisms that is gaining ground in the public discourse, in policy discourse, has been what is being mentioned as community monitoring. So what do we mean by community monitoring? I'm going to delve into that as I go along in the presentation. But there are two reasons why community monitoring is becoming increasingly attractive as one of the methods for improving public service delivery. A, it is considered to be low cost compared to the traditional top-down approaches for monitoring the delivery of public programs in developing countries. And secondly, it is potentially a tool which can empower democratic institutions at the grassroots, because here the communities or beneficiaries themselves who would have the power to monitor how these public programs are functioning and the amount of leakages from these public programs. So there are two reasons, these two particular reasons why there is this emphasis on community monitoring, and there is this push towards community monitoring in many of the developing countries. Okay, so what existing evidence do we have on the effectiveness of community monitoring? I'm just going to summarize what the existing literature is telling us about what are the key ingredients that we require in order for participatory monitoring to be effective. And if by effective I mean, I'm going to be focusing on effectiveness in terms of reducing corruption and improving the delivery of public services from that context. So number one, what we need in order for community monitoring to be effective is that the beneficiaries should have high stakes in the services that are being provided by that particular public program. And they should care deeply about those public services. And I'm going to discuss this as I go ahead. Secondly, given that they have high stakes, they should also be able to comprehend and measure the quality of those public services. So if I care about a certain public service, but I cannot measure what the quality of it is, where I can't figure out whether that's bad or good, then obviously I, as a potential beneficiary, can't do much even if I have the power to monitor the delivery of that public program, right? And finally, what we need is, so given these two things, number one, that you have high stakes in the public program that you're looking at, that you're trying to monitor in terms of the services that are being delivered, and number two, that there is a certain ease with which the stakeholder can comprehend the quality of that public program. Given those two, what you need is some sort of a contract between those who are delivering the public program and the beneficiaries. So at the end of the day, if the beneficiary is able to figure out that, hey, the quality of this particular program is not what it should be, or there are a lot of leakages from the program, they should be able to communicate that to those who are delivering the program, the officials, and there should be an understanding between the demand side and the supply side in terms of a contract, an agreement in what needs to be done that should be adhered to by those who are supplying those services. So these are three key essential ingredients which would be required in order for any community monitoring program to be successful in the sense of improving public service delivery, reducing corruption and leakages from public programs. And this would come from work that has been done in Africa, also some work that has been done in India. And so this is just a summary of the evidence that exists out there. Okay, so what are we going to do in this study? So what our primary aim over here is to look at the strengths and, more importantly, what are the shortfalls of community monitoring, or what we have been calling social audits in India. And particularly, what we are interested in is in thinking of what are the ways in which we can bolster the effectiveness of community monitoring in the design of community monitoring as it exists in particular parts of India that we'll be focusing on in this as I go ahead. So what we are going to do to answer these two questions is going to be, first of all, to quantify the effects of the only large-scale monitoring program that exists in India right now, which is in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and looking at a context which is the provision of employment through the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and the outcomes that we are interested in are speaking to this widespread concern that exists about malpractices in the implementation of public programs, and essentially that's corruption in public programs that we see to be very common in South Asia, and I mean this particular context in India. So just to give you a quick background, since Vigad has dealt on this just a while back, the NREGA provides a right-based employment to rural adults, and what is important from the context of this particular study is that the Act mandates the conduct of regular audits by local stakeholders or the Gram Sabha. This is the first time in India that you have a public program in which the Act itself ensures or asks for the beneficiaries to audit or to monitor the implementation of the program. So this is a big step in terms of the public programs that have been implemented in India over the decades. So what is interesting from our perspective is that there was only one state government, which is the Andhra Pradesh government, which responded to this mandate by institutionalizing the conduct of social audits. So we don't have this happening anywhere else in the country in terms of regular audits, systematic audits being occurring at regular intervals, which can be evaluated. So this is the only large-scale community monitoring initiative, and I would say probably the only large-scale community monitoring initiative anywhere in the world, particularly anywhere in the developing world. And so what's interesting about this community monitoring initiative is that it's not completely grassroots driven. There's a top-down component to it, in the sense that the Rural Development Department has taken the initiative to conduct these social audits. So you need to have a combination of personnel who are at the state level and the district level, who would train auditors who are local beneficiaries, and together all these three different components, the state level auditors, the district level auditors, and the village social auditors, would together conduct these audits on a regular basis. So you have a top-down component together with a grassroots participation, and I'm going to discuss this particular style of monitoring later on as I go along in the presentation. And what is interesting is that you have this 100% probability of an audit happening in every sub-district. So so for sure, if the audit hasn't happened today, there is a 100% probability that is going to happen tomorrow. So everybody is going to be facing this audit in the state. Okay, so just to give you a background on the data. The data were extracted from official social audit reports, as Vegard mentioned, and this is from 100 randomly sampled sub-districts of across 8 districts in Andhra Pradesh. So sub-districts, so the big, you have districts which are larger, and then you have sub-districts, and within sub-districts you have gram panchayats. So within these 100 randomly sampled sub-districts, we selected 3 gram panchayats within each. So we ended up with 3 gram panchayats, or 300 rather gram panchayats across the entire 8 districts that we have in our sample. And we look at data, official audit reports going from 2006 to 2010. So we end up with approximately about 700 audits during the period that we are looking at. So the shaded regions are the ones, the districts that we look at. So that encompasses 5 districts in Telangana, which is relatively more poor, and typically you would expect worse public service delivery in the Telangana districts. And then you have some districts which are in the south, which is Rayalaseema, and then coastal, which are relatively more developed compared to the Telangana regions. So we are trying to look at the entire distribution in a sense in terms of the delivery of the quality of the delivery of public services in Andhra Pradesh. So what are the outcomes that we are interested in? So there are 2 components, the 2 main components of MGNREGA. One is related to labor, because it is a program that's supposed to generate employment. So the main issue over here is, what are the irregularities related to the labor component. And the way this information is gathered is through door-to-door verification process of the households who've been participating in projects under MGNREGA and getting employed through that. And the second component is the materials part of the project. So the material component would be, that the road has been sanctioned for construction under MGNREGA and there are laborers working on it. So that is the labor component. And then the material component would be would involve what was the length of that road, what was the quality of the road, and so on and so forth. And those verification exercises would typically be done by the more experienced state and district level auditors. And so there is a verification process in terms of the complaints being filed or the irregularities being filed, ultimately coming up for public hearing at the end of the verification process. So the possibility of having these frivolous complaints or frivolous irregularities is minimized as far as possible. So what we have over here is probably a lower bound on the true extent of irregularities that you would see, given that households have to come forth to register these irregularities. So you can think of a context where there might be threats and intimidation of households. So the number of irregularities that you would get would typically be less than what the actual extent of these irregularities might be. So to just give you an idea then, we're looking across 3 audits over this period of 2006 to 2010. And what we see is, so we have, so these 3 bars essentially for each audit look at the total irregularities, the labor irregularities, the number of labor irregularities and the number of materials irregularities. We see a sort of an increase in the total number of irregularities, but what is interesting is that the largest number of irregularities relate to the labor component, lesser to the materials component. But what is pertinent from our perspective is also to note that though the number of materials related irregularities might be significantly lower, the amount of leakages in terms of the amounts per complaints are almost double in real terms of material irregularities as compared to labor irregularities. So you can make a lot more money for per material theft as compared to theft in the labor component of the program. So just to give you a bit of a conceptual framework of what we are trying to do over here. You can think of, so I don't know if that's getting cut off. So we can think of, first of all, what is the capacity that the audit teams have in terms of catching these irregularities or detecting these irregularities. So on one hand, they could have sufficient capacity to detect irregularities at the outset, and there would be another set of irregularities where they would not have sufficient capacity and there's potential learning going over time. Okay. Again, given these irregularities, we can divide them into two components. One is those in which beneficiaries have high stakes. So that's the labor component, because that's a private good. I care about the wages that I get or not. I'm not so concerned about whether the road actually got constructed or not, but I do care about whether I got my wages or not. So that's the private good, the private component of the program. And given that you have these high stakes in the labor component, then I can divide the irregularities into those which are easy to detect. For instance, it could be non-payment of wages or delay in payment of wages. Those are relatively easy to detect because I go and talk to a household and they tell me, hey, I worked for so many days, but I got less than what I deserved, or I haven't got my payment for the last 3 months. And there could be hard to detect irregularities in the labor component, such as you could have ghost workers or you could have bribes. So the easy to detect are the ones in which the auditors, you would expect for them to have sufficient capacity to detect those irregularities and have less capacity at the outset and a lot of learning going on in the hard to detect irregularities in the labor component. And similarly, you would have the material components, which is again the public good aspect of the program, where I don't care about whether the road actually got constructed because, that's a public good out there. I care more about the labor component. And again, I can classify those into easy to detect irregularities in the material component and the hard to detect, which could be substandard quality, bribes, and so on and so forth. So what we would expect theoretically is that given that there are high stakes that the beneficiaries have in the labor component, and that there is sufficient capacity at the outset to detect easy to decipher irregularities, the first impact that you would expect of audits coming in would be that the easy to detect irregularities should decline over repeated audits, particularly in the labor component and also in the material components. And then over time, we might see some decline in material component depending upon how much learning the auditors are doing over time as they go on repeating the audit process. Okay? So what we do is that we try to focus on impacts, but we recognize that we have limitations imposed by the fact that the social audits were not rolled out randomly. We came into evaluating this program after the program had already been rolled out, and you can understand for reasons, for political reasons, it would be very hard to randomize it. And of course, we have an absence of baseline comparison. So what's the best that we can do over here in terms of understanding or linking the conduct of audits to the potential impact is to look at what is the effect of repeated audits. What would I get if I have multiple audits happening in one particular sub-district or GP to the delivery of this particular program over time. And that's what we are going to focus on. But we have certain confounding factors here. For instance, we have to worry about bureaucratic efficiency at the sub-district level, because the sub-district is the nodal administrative unit which is implementing the program. So we conduct all the analysis looking across TPs within the same sub-district. We have to be worried about the fact that awareness levels might be improving over time. There would be learning by auditors, and as a result of that, you could just have an increase in the number of reported irregularities, even though the actual incidence of corruption has not gone up, right? So we have to control for these specific trends. And there could be differences in the implementation of the program in terms of its characteristics, in terms of the political economy. So there could be very district-specific trends. So these are some of the things that we want to address. And so what we get eventually, after taking into account all these potential confounding factors, is that we find that the total number of labor-related irregularities did not change, but there was a more than 300% increase in the number of material-related irregularities over the period that we are looking at. So you see this consistent increase in the number of these materials-related irregularities, which can be either easy to detect or they can be hard to detect, and that's what we get into next, which is classify these labor-related irregularities and material-related irregularities into those which are easy to detect and which have, in which beneficiaries have high stakes, versus those which are hard to detect. And what we find is that if you remember, what we said was that the first effect we should see is that the easy to detect irregularities should fall, and we don't see any effect at all. And what we see is that there's a significant increase in irregularities related to bribes and missing expenditure records, which are harder to detect, and in the low stakes component of the program, and a marginally significant decline in the real amount per labor complaint. Okay, so I'm going to skip these robustness findings, robustness checks on the on the results that we ran, but we ran multiple robustness checks to be sure of the results that we get. And what we then conclude is that we do not detect a significant effect of social audit process on reducing the aggregate number of irregularities. We find an insignificant effect on the number of easy to detect irregularities, which should have declined over this period, given that those were the kind of irregularities in which the auditors had sufficient capacity and the beneficiaries had high stakes in. But what is also very interesting is this startling shift in the anatomy of irregularities. With this significant move from, without a decline in labor-related irregularities, towards this 300% increase, more than 300% increase in materials-related irregularities. So it obviously points to the fact that there's quicker learning by the transgressors as compared to the auditors. They are staying a step ahead of the auditors. And as I pointed out to you earlier, what it also tells us is that the potential for extracting rents from the material, from thefts in the material component is way higher as compared to the labor component. So relative to the cost of effort that it goes into thefts in the material components, the benefits are much higher. So while the audit process may have been effective in detecting irregularities, the audits, according to the study that we have done, and we can say this with some degree of confidence, that the audits were not effective in terms of a deterrent, and they had, if any, completely marginal impact, no impact on reducing irregularities. So what are the policy recommendations? For us to be able to make any policy recommendations, what is really important for us is to understand, why do we not see any effects? Why did we not see the minimum effect that we expected to see? And there is a complete lack of credibility of the audit process here, because of which we don't see any effects. They are not resulting in an enforceable contract in terms of allocating responsibilities to those who've been found guilty of conducting these irregularities, and it has not punish those who've been found guilty of these irregularities. So I'll give you some statistics over here. So what we have is disciplinary action and recoveries by district over the period 2006 to 13. So these are all the districts which are in our sample. And we look at type of disciplinary action that has been taken. We classify them into minor, medium, and major. And if you look at major punishments, which would be termination or dismissal from service, it is not even 1%, not even 1% of the total number of the proportion of people who've been found responsible for these irregularities. And what is even more interesting is that more than 87% of the theft is yet to be recovered. And I'm looking at this period from 2006 to 2013, which is a 7-year period. So it is very disappointing that you have this mechanism in place, you're able to detect who's responsible for the theft, but you're not carrying, the state is not responding in terms of punishing those who've been found guilty. Secondly, what we think is one of the reasons why the audit process has not been effective as a deterrent has been the lack of capacity on the part of auditors, and that becomes obvious when we see the shift from the number of labor-related irregularities to the materials component, because those who are stealing from the program are learning much faster than the auditors, and the auditors are not able to keep up with them, and that could be because of this lack of capacity. And over this period that we've studied, and this is not coming from our results, but we don't see this program of social audits organically arising in other parts of the country. And why would that be? Because even though the Act says that the Gram Sabhas or the beneficiaries should conduct the audit, it is unlikely to happen. It would be naive to expect that those who are completely unaware of their entitlements, are less educated, are mostly illiterate, would be able to take advantage of this particular act to question the officials who are implementing the program. So the top-down element of the audit process here seems to be essential to leverage grassroots participation. So let me just conclude over here. What India is seeing now is an attempt to scale up the audit process, as I've described over here, the social audit process, to other states in the country. And this is a great opportunity for other state governments to learn in terms of course correction and ensure that the community monitoring process is credible and it's effective. What we do understand is that though this might not have been effective in reducing the number of irregularities or reducing theft, it certainly has acted as an important mechanism for improving awareness and of the beneficiaries in terms of what they are entitled to. Community monitoring is extremely low cost. It's just 1%, 0.5 to 1% of annual MGNREGA expenditures. But unless this program, the social audit program, is made credible in the sense of ensuring that this contract is signed not literally, but figuratively speaking, that there's an understanding between the beneficiaries and the service providers on what needs to be done to address the concerns of the beneficiaries. Community monitoring cannot be an effective mechanism for reducing corruption and theft and improving the quality of public service delivery in the subcontinent. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzana.